The rain fell hard against the windows of the Midnight Roast, a small diner that sat alone on the edge of New Denver, like a forgotten memory. Marcus Chun wiped down the counter for the third time that hour. Not because it was dirty, but because his hands needed something to do at 3 in the morning, when the world felt empty and quiet. He had worked the night shift for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah had passed away from the sickness that had swept through the colony districts. The nights were easier than the days somehow, and the silence of the diner felt like an old friend rather than an enemy. Earth had changed so much since the aliens came, since humanity learned they were not alone in the universe, since the Galactic Compact opened the doors between worlds. Marcus had seen plenty of strange beings walk through his door in the past 3 years. Creatures with too many eyes, or not enough limbs or skin that glowed like fireflies in summer, but he had never seen anything quite like the figure that pushed through the door that night, bringing the cold rain and something heavier with him. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, with scales as black as space itself covering every inch of his powerful body. 2 massive wings lay folded against his back like a cape made of darkness, and his eyes burned with a golden light that seemed to hold ancient fires within them. He was a Dracorian, Marcus realized with a start. One of the dragon people that ruled half the galaxy, according to the news feeds. They were supposed to be proud and dangerous and powerful beyond measure. The kind of beings that conquered worlds before breakfast and never bothered to learn the names of lesser species, but this one did not look proud or dangerous as he slumped into the corner booth with a heaviness that Marcus recognized in his own bones. This one looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, broken in a way that had nothing to do with wounds. The other customers in the diner noticed too, and Marcus watched them shrink away like shadows fleeing from fire. Old Pete grabbed his coffee and moved to a booth on the far side of the room, and the young couple by the window suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Within minutes, the diner was nearly empty, except for Marcus and the dragon, who sat alone in the corner staring at nothing. The Dracorian did not order anything, did not even look at the menu, just sat there with his clawed hands flat on the table and his golden eyes fixed on the rain streaming down the glass. Marcus watched him for a long moment, feeling something stir in his chest that he could not quite name. He knew that feeling, though. Knew it better than he knew his own reflection. It was the feeling of being alone in a crowded room, of carrying a weight that no one else could see, of wanting someone to notice that you were drowning, even as you kept your head above water. Marcus made a decision then, the kind of small decision that changes everything. Without anyone realizing it at the time, he brewed a fresh pot of the house special, the dark roast that Sarah had always said could wake the dead and make them grateful for. The poured a large cup, added nothing because he did not know what alien dragons liked in their coffee, and carried it across the diner to the corner booth. The Dracorian looked up as Marcus approached, and those golden eyes held a warning in them that would have sent most beings running. But Marcus had faced death when Sarah took her last breath in his arms, had stared into the void and found it staring back, and a pair of glowing eyes did not frighten him anymore. He set the cup down on the table with a gentle thud. "On the house," he said simply, keeping his voice warm and easy like he was talking to any other customer on any other night. "You look like you could use it." The Dracorian stared at him with an expression Marcus could not read, those ancient eyes widening just slightly as if Marcus had done something unexpected and strange. "You approach me without fear," the creature said, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder rolling across mountain peaks. "You do not know who I am." Marcus shrugged and pulled a rag from his apron to wipe a spot on the table that did not need wiping. "I know you came in here alone at 3 in the morning looking like the universe just kicked you in the teeth," he replied. "I know that look because I see it in the mirror most days. And I know that coffee helps even when nothing else does. He gestured toward the small containers on the table. Cream and sugar is right there if you want it. And if you need anything else, just holler. The Dracorian continued to stare at him as if Marcus were some puzzle he could not solve. Some equation that refused to balance no matter how many times he checked the numbers. "Why would you do this?" he asked. And there was something raw beneath the thunder in his voice now. Something vulnerable that seemed out of place in such a powerful being. "What do you want from me?" Marcus felt a sad smile cross his face. The kind of smile that came from knowing too much about loneliness and loss. "I do not want anything from you, friend. I just thought you might like some coffee." Sometimes that is all there is to it. He turned to walk back to the counter but paused and looked over his shoulder. "The pie is pretty good too if you get hungry. The cherry is fresh from this morning." Then he was gone, back behind the counter. Back to wiping things that did not need wiping while the rain continued to fall outside. The Dracorian sat motionless for a long time, staring at the cup of coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he had forgotten how to ask. Then slowly, carefully, he wrapped his clawed hands around the ceramic cup and felt the warmth seep into his scales. He lifted it to his lips and drank. And the taste was bitter and rich, and somehow exactly what he needed in that moment in all his centuries of life. In all the palaces and throne rooms and conquered worlds, no one had ever simply given him something without wanting something in return. No one had ever looked at him and seen a person instead of a symbol, a being instead of a power. The dragon who ruled half the galaxy sat in a tiny diner on an unremarkable planet and felt something crack inside his chest. Something old and frozen that had been there so long he had forgotten it existed. He did not know this human, did not even know his name. But somehow this small act of kindness had reached through centuries of armor and touched something that still remembered how to feel outside. The rain continued to fall, and inside the midnight roast, a friendship began to grow in the space between a cup of coffee and a word of kindness. Neither of them knew it yet. But the universe had just shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The dragon's true name was Virantos Calcither, a name that had not been spoken aloud by anyone in over a century, because to speak it was forbidden by ancient law. He was the 437th Emperor of the Dracorian Dominion, supreme ruler of 800 star systems, commander of the greatest war fleet the galaxy had ever known. His bonheur word could shatter worlds, and his silence could condemn billions. And every living being in half the known universe either served him or feared him or both, but none of that mattered. Here in this small diner on this small planet, where a human had just given him free coffee, Ranthos sat in the corner, booth long after the coffee grew cold, thinking about how strange it was to be treated like an ordinary person. He had not felt ordinary in 300 years, not since the crown had been placed upon his head, and he had become something more and less than a living buying Dracorian. Emperors were not supposed to want things or need things or feel things the way common creatures did. They were supposed to be perfect symbols of power and control, frozen statues that moved and spoke but never truly lived. His advisors were the finest minds in the Dominion, but they never told him the truth about anything because they feared his displeasure. His generals had conquered 100 worlds in his name, but they had never once asked him how he felt about the blood that was spilled. His subjects worshipped him from distances so great that their love felt like cold starlight, beautiful but unable to warm anything. Viranthos had not had a real conversation with another being in over 100 years, had not laughed or argued or shared a moment of genuine connection since before his father died and left him alone on the throne. The loneliness had crept up on him, slowly like frost spreading across glass, so gradual that he did not notice until he was completely frozen inside, And then came the assassination attempt 3 cycles ago. The one that had finally cracked something in his ancient heart. The assassin had been a child. A young female barely past her first molting. Sent by rebels who called themselves the Free Stars, she had come at him with a blade made of neutron crystal, one of the few materials that could pierce Dracorian scales. And she had moved with the desperate courage of someone who had. Nothing left to Los Varantos had disarmed her easily, because he was old and powerful, and had survived 1,000 such attempts before. But when he looked into her eyes expecting to see hatred or fear or rage, he saw nothing at all to her. He was not a person, not a being with thoughts and feelings and dreams. He was just an obstacle, a symbol of everything wrong with the galaxy. A thing to be destroyed. The rebels called him the Frozen Throne. And in that moment, he realized they were right. He had become so distant, so untouchable, so far removed from the lives of ordinary beings that even those who wanted to kill him could not see him as real. That night he had returned to his private chambers in the Imperial Palace and stood before the mirror for hours, trying to find the person he used to be beneath all the layers of duty and power and isolation. He could not find him anywhere. So Varantos had done something he had never done before, something that would have shocked his advisors and terrified his guards if they had known. He took a small shuttle from the Royal Fleet, disabled all the tracking systems, and flew away from everything he had ever known. He did not have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to go somewhere that no one knew his name or his title or his terrible power. He wanted to see if he could still feel like a person, if there was anything left inside him worth saving. If the Frozen Throne could ever learn to feel warmth again, Earth was perfect for his purposes, because it was small and new to the galactic community and utterly unremarkable in every way. Humans were considered a minor species, clever but fragile, interesting but unimportant in the grand scheme of things. No, one would think to look for the Dracorian Emperor in a place like this, among people like these. And so he had wandered the streets of New Denver in the rain, hiding his wings beneath a traveler's cloak and keeping his head down to avoid attracting attention. Walked for hours without purpose, passing through crowds of humans who hurried past without a second glance, until eventually he found himself standing outside a small diner with warm light spilling from its windows. Something about the place called to him. Something about the way it sat alone on the edge of the city like a lighthouse in a storm. He went inside without really knowing why, sat down without ordering anything, and prepared to spend another night alone with his thoughts. Then the human came with his coffee and his kind eyes and his simple words that cut through 3 centuries of armor like they were nothing. You look like you could use it. Such simple words, such a small gesture, and yet Varantos could not remember the last time anyone had done something for him without expecting payment or favor or fear. The human did not know he was speaking to an emperor, did not know that the being before him could have him executed with a single word or reward him with enough wealth to buy a planet. He just saw someone who looked sad and decided to help Varantos finish the cold coffee, and sat there thinking about what that meant, about what kind of species would produce a person like this human. His scholars had written thousands of reports about humanity since Earth joined the Compact, analyzing their technology and their culture and their potential threat level, but none of those reports had mentioned this strange and irrational impulse to care for strangers without any benefit to themselves. It was inefficient and illogical, and absolutely beautiful in a way that Varantos had forgotten the universe could be. He looked across the diner at the human who was now wiping down the counter and humming softly to himself. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Varantos felt something warm stir in his chest. It was small and fragile and frightening, like a flame trying to catch in wet kindling. But it was there, and it was real. And it was more than he had felt in a very long time. The Emperor of the Dracorian Dominion decided then that he would come back tomorrow, and the night after that, and as many nights as it took to understand this strange human and his simple kindness. He did not know it yet. But that decision would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire galaxy. Sometimes the smallest choices ripple outward like waves in an infinite ocean, touching shores that no one could have imagined. And sometimes a cup of coffee given freely in the dark of night is worth more than all the conquered worlds in the universe. Varanthos returned to the diner the next night, and the night after that, and soon it became a pattern that neither of them spoke about, but both of them understood. He would arrive sometime after midnight, when the crowds were thin and the world felt quiet. And Marcus would pour him a cup of coffee without being asked, and sometimes sit across from him when the other customers were gone. They talked about small things at first. Safe things. The kind of conversations that strangers have when they are learning whether they can trust each other. Marcus told him about the weather on Earth and how the seasons changed in ways that still surprised him even after 40 years of living. He explained the rules of baseball even though Varanthos could not understand why anyone would care so much about hitting a small ball with a stick. He complained about the raccoon that kept breaking into the fall with a stick. He complained about the raccoon that the stick dumpster behind the diner, no matter how many times he fixed the lock. Varanthos listened to all of it with a fascination that surprised him, because these were such ordinary things, such mundane concerns compared to the affairs of empires and the fates of worlds. But that was exactly why he loved hearing about them, because they were real in a way that throne rooms and war councils had never felt real. On the third night, Marcus talked about his wife, Sarah, for the first time, and his voice grew soft and rough like sandpaper. Wrapped in silk, she had been a teacher at the local school, and she had loved to bake bread on Sunday mornings, and she had died 3 years ago from a sickness that the doctors could not cure. Marcus did not cry when he talked about her, but Varanthos could see the grief still living in his eyes, a permanent resident that would never fully leave. Does it not shame you to speak of such pain so openly? Varanthos asked. Because among his people, grief was a private thing that was never shown to others. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before shaking his head. Nah, holding it in is what breaks you, he said. My mother used to say that grief shared is grief halved, and I think she was right about that. He smiled a little sadly. Besides, Sarah deserves to be talked about. She deserves to have people know she existed and that she mattered, and that the world is a little darker without her in it. Varanthos thought about those words for a long time after Marcus went back to work. He thought about the child assassin, and the centuries of loneliness and all the feelings he had locked away, because emperors were not supposed to feel. And slowly, over the following nights, he began to speak of his own pain in small, careful pieces, like a man learning to walk again after a long illness. He did not reveal his true identity, because he was not ready for that yet. But he spoke of isolation and duty and the weight of being someone that others feared rather than loved. Marcus listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, without offering empty comfort or useless advice. He just listened and nodded and refilled the coffee when it ran low. And somehow that was exactly what Varanthos needed. I do not understand your species, Varanthos admitted on the 5th night. You are fragile and short-lived, and your technology is primitive compared to most of the galaxy. Marcus raised an eyebrow but did not seem offended. And yet, Varanthos continued, struggling to find the right words. You simply care about others without any reason, without any benefit to yourselves. It is the most inefficient thing I have ever seen. Marcus laughed at that, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Yeah, you are probably right about that, he agreed. But efficient is not the same as good. And sometimes The inefficient things are the ones that matter most. Viranthos was still thinking about that when the door to the diner opened and a small human child came, running inside like a tiny storm of energy and noise. She had dark hair like Marcus and paint stains on her fingers, and a gap-toothed smile that seemed too big for her little-faced daddy. She shouted, launching herself at Marcus, who caught her with practiced ease and swung her up onto the counter. "Sophie, what are you doing here so late?" Marcus asked. But his voice was warm and happy rather than angry. "You are supposed to be at Grandma's house. Grandma fell asleep during the movie and I was bored," the little girl explained. "Also, I made you a picture, and I wanted to show you right now." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and held it up proudly, revealing a drawing done in bright purple crayon. It was some kind of creature with wings and sharp teeth, and what might have been fire coming out of its mouth if you looked at it just right. "It is a dragon," Sophie announced. "From the story you told me about the space dragons who ruled the galaxy." Marcus glanced over at Viranthos with an expression that was half apology and half amusement. But Sophie had already noticed the massive alien sitting in the corner booth, and her eyes went wide with wonder. Rather than fear before Marcus could stop her, she had hopped down from the counter and marched right over to stand in front of Viranthos, with her drawing held out before her like an offering. "That is you," she declared with absolute certainty. "You are a space dragon just like in the stories." Viranthos stared down at this tiny human who showed no fear of him at all, who looked at him with curiosity and excitement rather than terror and submission, looked at the drawing with its purple scales and crooked wings, and felt something crack open inside his chest. It was not a good drawing by any artistic standard. The proportions were wrong, and the colors were unrealistic, and the fire looked more like an orange blob than actual flames, but it was given freely with joy and innocence and no expectation of anything in return. And that made it more valuable than any treasure in the imperial vaults. "It is," Viranthos said, and his voice came out rough and strange. "It is a magnificent likeness. You have captured my essence perfectly." Sophie beamed with pride, and then did something that no being had done in 300 years. She reached out and patted his massive, clawed hand like he was a friendly dog she had met in the park. "You can keep it," she said generously. "I will make another one for Daddy." Viranthos looked at this tiny human child and felt the frozen thing inside his chest finally begin to melt. He looked at Marcus, who was watching them with soft eyes and a knowing smile, and he realized that he had found something on this little planet that he had not known he was looking for, something that all his power and all his conquests had never been able to give him, and found a place where he was not an emperor or a symbol or a threat. He was just a person drinking coffee with friends, and that was worth more than all the stars in the sky. The warships came on the 7th day, descending through Earth's atmosphere like mountains falling from heaven. There were 3 of them, each one larger than anything humans had ever built, each one carrying enough firepower to turn the entire planet to ash in a matter of hours. They were Dracorian dreadnoughts, the most feared weapons in the galaxy, and they took up positions above New Denver like gods looking down on ants. Panic spread through the city like wildfire as news feeds screamed about invasion and destruction, and the end of everything. People ran through the streets not knowing where to go, and Earth's tiny defense forces scrambled their ships knowing full well they stood no chance against such overwhelming power. But the dreadnoughts did not fire, did not attack, did not do anything at all except hang there in the sky like they were waiting for something. Marcus watched through the windows of the midnight roast as the massive shapes blotted out the stars, and he felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had been alive long enough to know that warships did not come without reason, and he was afraid he knew exactly what that reason was. Viranthos stood beside him, staring up at the fleet with an expression that Marcus had never seen on his face before. Was the look of a man watching his past catch up with him. The look of someone who had run as far as he could and finally reached the end of the road. "They found me," he said quietly, and there was resignation in his voice rather than surprise. Marcus turned to look at his friend, really look at him, and saw him clearly for the first time, the proud bearing that even exhaustion could not hide. The way he spoke like someone used to being obeyed. The ancient weight in those golden eyes that spoke of centuries rather than years. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Who are you really?" Before Varentos could respond, a shuttle detached from the nearest dreadnought and descended toward the diner with terrifying speed, landed in the parking lot outside, its engines scorching the pavement black, and the door opened to reveal a squad of Dracorian warriors in armor that gleamed like polished obsidian. There were 12 of them, each one nearly as large as Varentos, each one radiating the kind of controlled violence that made the air itself feel heavy. They marched toward the diner in perfect formation and stopped just outside the door, then dropped to their knees as one in a gesture of absolute submission. Marcus watched through the window as the leader spoke in a voice loud enough to be heard through the glass. "All Father," the warrior called out, "we have searched the stars for you. The Dominion requires its Emperor." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emperor. He looked at Varentos, at Vire, and his friend who had sat in his diner drinking coffee and talking about raccoons and learning about baseball. This whole time he had been talking to the ruler of half the galaxy, the most powerful being in the known universe, and he had treated him like just another customer who needed a warm drink and a kind word. Varentos met his eyes, and Marcus saw shame there. Real shame that looked wrong on such a proud face. "I'm sorry for the deception," Varentos said, and his voice was heavy with emotion. "I did not know how to tell you. I did not want this to change what we had built." Marcus stood there for a long moment, processing everything, trying to reconcile the lonely stranger from that first night with the Emperor that an entire galaxy apparently worshipped and feared. He thought about all their conversations, all the small moments they had shared, the way Varentos had held Sophie's drawing like it was made of precious gold. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He turned around, walked to the coffee pot, and poured a fresh cup. "Refill before you go?" he asked, holding it out like this was just another night. And those were not warships hanging in the sky outside. The warriors in the parking lot stared in disbelief, their disciplined formations wavering for just a moment at this impossible scene. No one spoke to the Emperor this way. No one addressed him with such casual familiarity. No one acted like he was just a person rather than a living god. But Varentos felt something break open inside him at that gesture, something that released all the frozen loneliness he had carried for so long. This human knew who he was now, knew the truth about his power and his position, and still treated him exactly the same as before. The coffee was not an act of submission or a desperate attempt to gain favor. It was just a friend offering another friend a drink before a long journey. Varentos took the cup and held it in his clawed hands, feeling the warmth seep through his scales one last time. "Marcus Chun," he said formally, and his voice carried the weight of imperial authority, even though his eyes were soft. "I must return to my duties. The Dominion cannot function without its throne." He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he had never learned to express. "But I find I do not wish to forget what I have learned here. What you have taught me about kindness and connection and the value of simple things." Marcus nodded, and there were tears in his eyes even though he was smiling. "What did I teach you?" He asked. Varentos looked at the small diner, at the coffee cup in his hands, at the child's drawing that was still folded carefully in his cloak. "That strength is not found in ruling alone," he said slowly. "That power means nothing without connection. That a cup of coffee freely given can be worth more than 1,000 conquered worlds." He turned to face his warriors, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the parking lot with absolute authority. Earth is now under the eternal protection of the Dracorian Dominion. Any species that threatens this world or its people will face the full might of our armada. This is my imperial decree, and it shall stand until the stars themselves grow cold. The warriors bowed their heads in acknowledgement. It shall be done, All-Father. Viranthos turned back to Marcus one last time, and there was more emotion in his golden eyes than he had shown in 3 centuries. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing me when I had forgotten how to see myself. Then he walked out of the diner, through the line of kneeling warriors, and into the shuttle that would carry him back to his empire. Marcus watched him go. Watched the shuttle rise into the sky. Watched the massive dreadnoughts turn and begin their journey back to the star. Sophie appeared beside him, having snuck out of the back room where he had hidden her when the ships arrived. Is your dragon friend leaving? She asked. Sadly, Marcus put his arm around his daughter and held her close. Yeah, sweetheart. He has to go home now. He has a very important job to do. Will he come back? Marcus thought about the look in Varenthus's eyes, about the warmth that had finally broken through all that ancient ice. Yeah, he said softly, watching the lights of the fleet fade into the night sky. I think he will. 5 years had passed since the night the warships came, and the Midnight Roast had become the most famous diner in the entire galaxy. It was not because of the food. Though Marcus's coffee had developed a legendary reputation that spread across a dozen star systems, was not because of the location. Though Earth had become a protected world that no one dared threaten, it was because once every year without fail, a shuttle bearing the imperial crest of the Dracorian Dominion would descend from the stars and land in that same scorched parking lot. And the Emperor Viranthos Calcither, ruler of the Dominion and conqueror of the Void, would step out wearing simple traveling clothes instead of his imperial regalia. He would walk into the diner like any other customer, settle into that same corner booth, and spend one entire week being nothing more than Vir, a regular who liked his coffee black and enjoyed hearing stories about ordinary life. The galaxy watched these annual visits with complete bewilderment, unable to understand what could possibly draw the most powerful being in known space to such an unremarkable place. Scholars wrote long papers, trying to analyze the political implications, wondering if this was some kind of subtle power play or diplomatic strategy. The Galactic Council debated endlessly about what it meant for the balance of power that the Dracorian Emperor seemed so attached to a tiny human diner none of them understood. But Marcus did, and Varanthos did, and that was all that mattered on this particular visit. The 5th one since that fateful week. Varanthos sat in his usual booth, watching Marcus talk to a Thessalian ambassador who had wandered in looking lost and lonely. The ambassador was weeping quietly, overwhelmed by some grief she could not name. And Marcus sat across from her, speaking in soft tones and refilling her strange purple tea. Word had spread through the galaxy about this place, about the human who offered kindness to strangers without asking anything in return. Beings from 100 different worlds had started making pilgrimages to the Midnight Roast, hoping to find whatever it was that had touched the Emperor's frozen heart. Some of them were powerful rulers and generals and corporate leaders who had everything except someone to truly see them. Some of them were ordinary workers and travelers and lost souls who had simply heard rumors of a place where everyone was welcome. Marcus treated them all the same way he had treated Varanthos that first night, with coffee and conversation and the simple gift of being noticed. You have created something unprecedented, Varanthos said when Marcus finally returned to his booth. A place where power is meaningless and kindness is the only currency that matters. Marcus shrugged in that way he always did, humble and unassuming despite everything. I just make coffee and talk to people. It is not that complicated. It is exactly that complicated, Varanthos replied. And also exactly that simple, which is what makes it so extraordinary. Sophie came through the door then. No longer a little girl, but a young woman of 17, with her mother's kind eyes and her father's warm smile. She was studying xenobiology at the university now. Inspired by all the strange and wonderful beings she had met at her father's diner, but she still made time to visit during the Emperor's annual trips. Still called him her dragon uncle, with the same casual affection she had shown when she was small. Uncle Vire. She called out, hurrying over to give him a hug that would have gotten anyone else executed for. Presumption Varantos returned the embrace with a gentleness that still surprised his guards every single year. You have grown again, he observed. Soon you will be taller than your father. That is not hard, Sophie laughed. Dad is basically a hobbit. Marcus made a noise of protest from behind the counter, and Sophie stuck her tongue out at him in responsive Varantos. Watched this simple family moment with something warm glowing in his chest. Something that had grown stronger every year since he first walked through that door. The drawing Sophie had given him that first week was framed now, hanging in a place of honor behind the counter where everyone could see it. It was still a terrible drawing by any artistic standard. Lopsided and messy with colors that no real Dracorian had ever possessed, but it was the most valuable thing Marcus owned. More precious than any treasure the Emperor had ever tried to give him. When I die, Varantos said quietly, watching Sophie argue with her father about something trivial and wonderful. When my spirit joins the eternal void, as all Dracorians eventually must, I believe I will remember two things above all else. Marcus looked at him with those kind eyes that had seen through all his armor from the very beginning. What two things? The stars I have conquered, Varantos replied. All the victories and the glory and the power I accumulated across 3 centuries of rule. He paused, looking at the drawing on the wall, at Sophie's laughter, at the coffee cup warming his clawed hands, and the human who gave me coffee when I had nothing to offer in return, who saw a person when everyone else saw only a throne. Marcus smiled and topped off his cup. You had plenty to offer, Vair. You just did not know it yet. What did I have? Yourself, Marcus said simply. That is all anyone really has to give, and it is always enough when you give it honestly. Outside the diner, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Cold and vast and infinite beyond human understanding ships from 100 worlds passed through Earth's system now, all of them knowing that this little planet was untouchable, protected by the most powerful fleet in the galaxy because of one man's kindness. And inside the midnight roast, the Emperor of the Dracorian Dominion was arguing with a 17-year-old human about whether dinosaurs could technically be classified as dragons. He was losing the argument badly and enjoying every moment of it. The Dominion had changed under his rule in the past 5 years, becoming something softer and stranger than it had ever been before. He had started a program to actually listen to his subjects, to hear their grievances and their hopes instead of just their fear. He had opened schools and hospitals in places that had never known such things. Remembering what Marcus had said about caring for others without expecting anything in return, his advisors thought he had gone mad. But his people had started to love him rather than just fear him. And that made all the difference across the galaxy. Slowly but surely, humanity's reputation had begun to shift as word of the Emperor's friendship spread. They were no longer seen as just a minor species, primitive and fragile and unimportant in the grand scheme of things. They were becoming known as something else entirely, something that did not have a word in most alien languages. They were the species that offered coffee to strangers, that treated lonely dragons like friends, that believed kindness was worth more than power. It was inefficient and illogical, and it made them the most beloved and most puzzling beings the galaxy had ever encountered. Some said it also made them the most dangerous. because an empire built on fear could be conquered. But a reputation built on love could only grow stronger. Marcus did not think about any of that, though. He just poured coffee and listened to stories and treated every lost soul who wandered through his door like they mattered, because they did matter. Every single one of them, from the mightiest emperor to the lowest wanderer. That was the lesson Varentos had learned in this little diner. The truth that had thawed his frozen heart. Every being in the universe was carrying something heavy, fighting some battle that no one else could see, and sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply notice them. Offer them warmth, let them know they were not alone. The night grew late, and the stars grew bright, and inside the midnight roast, the coffee stayed hot. Sophie finally won her argument about dinosaurs and demanded ice cream as her prize. Marcus laughed, and Varanthos pretended to be outraged, and somewhere in the vast coldness of space, the universe felt just a little bit warmer than it had before. This was humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not weapons or technology or conquest, just kindness. Freely given, asking nothing in return, and somehow, against all logic and reason, it was more than enough. It was everything.